Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. Today, we have another incredibly special guest with us today. Her name is Angela Wu, or also known as the Sassy Asian Therapist on Instagram. And she is honestly, I'm just so excited to have her on the podcast. She honestly is just a voice of empowerment, especially for the AAPI community. If you check out her page on social, she tackles imposter syndrome, mental health within Asian culture, perfectionism, and a lot of issues that I feel like a lot of Asian Americans deal with and honestly just don't talk about enough. So I'm so happy to have her on here to discuss the different kind of nuances that and what it means to really be a child of a refugee or a refugee itself. So, Angela, thanks so much. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Dorothy, for having me.
So, Angela, let's just start off. If you wanted to do a quick introduction on who you are and why you decided to become a therapist.
Yeah. So my name is Angela. I am Taiwanese American, and I consider myself 1.5 generation, meaning I was born in Taiwan, and my family and I immigrated here when I was 2. So, growing up, experienced a lot of like the immigrant struggles. And being like the cultural broker of the family, going through some intergenerational issues, trauma, just understanding Taiwan's history, knowing that there's been a lot of trauma there. And so just like navigating through those things my whole life and struggle with a lot of mental health. I've just experienced a lot of layers of silencing because of, cultural pieces as a woman. And then on top of that, being the model minority. And then actually another layer of having been we grew up undocumented. And then within that, having like other issues that we navigate, right, in the system. And that all really just compounded and affected my own mental health. Wasn't until college when I first, got therapy, and it really just opened my eyes to what healing meant, gave me vocabulary to be able to articulate what I was experiencing, because growing up we didn't have that emotional language. So because of that, I really wanted to pursue like this path because I want people to experience the freedom and healing that I've experienced. And since, the pandemic, seeing the rise of anti-Asian violence, I really felt the need to like be a resource for my community. And I just started out and opened my own practice.
Yeah. And was that always like your dream once you decided to become a therapist, I can only imagine like this has always been your dream to really just start your own, right?
Yeah, I actually, before this, my past life, I was a teacher, a high school math teacher. And that was like not even the road that I was going on. Like I always knew I wanted to be a therapist, but then teaching really informed why I do what I do. Because I taught in at-risk communities, saw a lot of police brutality and systemic violence. So a lot of trauma inside the classroom, which is why I would say I have an interest in trauma.
So would you say, Angela, then that I guess you would then say you specialize in clients? Like what kind of clients are your kind of forte and the types that you deal with?
Yeah, I specifically work with Asian American clients, a lot of women. So especially because of, systemic issues of patriarchy or cultural things, that's something that I really incorporate into my work as a therapist and my clinical lens. So specifically with Asian American populations.
Yeah, no, you can honestly tell, like, even just looking at your page, people who don't know you at all can get so much resource out of your page. Like, you're so educational about the certain topics that I feel like specifically Asian American or people with color deal with. It's like a
Hmm.
breath of fresh air almost, because
Hmm.
um, you kind of mentioned that whole silency thing. We all grow up with this idea of just not talking about our feelings, and even our parents not talking about their feelings, and it's something that we culturally just internalize as like sweeping under the rug and just pushing forward. And um,
Yeah.
I knew you were the perfect person to bring onto the podcast to really talk about trauma, because I think a lot of listeners who listen to the podcast come to us because this is the first time that they've ever been able to listen to a parent figure, my father, a
Mm.
parent figure,
Yeah.
talk about exactly what had happened during the Khmer Rouge. I mean, going deep
Mm.
into the weeds of something that they had never even been able to get a few words out of their parents, we have a full
Yeah.
podcast for. And so,
Yeah.
my first question is, why do you think it's so hard for people like my dad or my mom and other refugees to talk about it? Why is it so hard for them?
Yeah. Well, even before diving into that, like I want to commend like your dad for how brave he is. Like that is it takes an immense like amount of courage to be able to face the very thing that you wanted to escape from,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And and that's really the nature of trauma. Like it's not that they don't want to talk about it. It's that they can't because it's the very thing that is basically it feels like the end of their life. They've spent their whole life trying to survive out of the trauma. Why would they want to go revisit it again? Why would they talk about things that are going to re-trigger that? And that's avoidance is one of the classic symptoms
Mm.
of trauma, right? Because it's about trying to keep themselves safe. Even though it's not physically safe anymore, it's psychologically and emotionally safe. So that any kind of triggers, any kind of semblance that's going to remind them of that trauma, whether it's situational, like places, smells,
Mhm.
thoughts, right, sounds, tastes, things
Mhm.
that can all re-trigger trauma.
Mhm.
So it makes so much sense that someone who has been traumatized is going to do everything that they possibly can in their power to not have to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I, and people ask me this all the time. They're like, how did you get your dad to talk? Like, when I feel bad because I don't really know the answer. I think, he's always wanted to share his story, and I gave him the platform, so he just started talking. But it's like, in my head, I'm thinking, how can I encourage more more people to talk about, I guess, how do I encourage more refugees to talk about it? And it was
Mm.
a healing process for my father. I'm curious, like, a lot of people ask, like, I remember one time you talked about secondary trauma. Like, is it even worth it for kids to try to ask their parents and dive in and encourage them to talk, or is that not a good direction to go? How
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a good question. I think it really depends on your relationship with your parent,
Okay.
right? Because trauma is about safety, right? It's about like physical, like wanting um, that physical or emotional, psychological safety. And if the person who's traumatized doesn't necessarily feel those things,
Mm.
right, they may not feel safe to talk about it. And also, when you talk about your trauma, you're also exposing yourself to how the other person is going to react,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so, if the person reacts in like, oh, like that's the past, don't worry about it, right? It just it feels rejecting. Or if the person asks more questions because they're genuinely curious and you're not ready to go there yet,
Mhm.
it can feel like even more invasive because it's like you feel like your boundaries are being violated, so all of a sudden you're unsafe again. So you have to be really careful
Mhm.
about establishing a safe environment. But also, like as children of immigrants or people who've experienced trauma, it's we're often in this role of like being our parents, so like almost like caregiver.
Mhm.
It's like we are parentified, right? Because at a young age, we helped our parents navigate the system because of what language barriers, or maybe like for you, like you worked in the donut shop. You had to be an adult super quick. You didn't have a chance to be a kid, really.
Right.
And so, like growing up, you have this sense of like responsibility of an adult. So you're used to being over responsible, right?
Mhm.
That bleeds into the and that can get a little bit complex, because then you may start to feel responsible for your parents' healing or for your parents' well-being, or everything you do. It can be tied to like feelings of guilt. If you don't do this,
Right.
then it means like you're not a good daughter, you're not this or whatever, right?
Right.
So also just to be aware of that sense of over responsibility, like what is your intention of having your parents like speak about this? Is it because you want to heal them? Like you want them,
Mhm.
but also recognizing like that's not your role. Your role is to be their child,
Mhm.
right? Because that could be on the flip end a lot of burden for children of immigrants.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's really hard for me. It's really hard to just cast the whole blanket and say, okay, well, this helped with my father talking about it. We don't know how it's going to help others, and how they're going to receive it, and if they have the same relationship and same kind of uh, safety bubble, right? It's so
Mm-hmm.
different for everybody.
Yeah. And I say like even it's important to have community that like maybe peers, like
Mhm.
to like have these conversations. That might be something that is more doable than a hierarchy, because like when you think about parent child relationship, there is a hierarchy, right?
Sure.
And so parents may feel like, oh, it's not our responsibility to put our stuff onto our kids.
Right.
And then thinking about like as a parent, or as an
Yeah.
Asian, right? And even as a male, or like being your dad, like there might be that extra layer of like, oh, men are not supposed to be vulnerable, or things like that. Or like for some of the older generation, they just don't have language to be able to articulate their emotions,
Mhm.
right?
Language barriers.
Language barriers, but even emotional literacy,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
When you think about like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it basically outlines like at the most basic human level, we need like physiological safety.
Mhm.
We need food, shelter, a place, that a place that's safe, right? Clothes, whatever. And then until you're able to have those needs met, then you can move to the next tier, which is emotional and psychological needs, right? For the older generation or parents who have been in trauma, right? They're still at that bottom tier of just getting their physical needs met.
Mhm.
So that for them is their ceiling,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And because that's their ceiling, they can't move up to that to get their emotional needs met, because they've been striving their whole life just to have that bare minimum. And us as second generation have that their ceiling as our floor.
Yeah.
And that's why we're able to get to this part where we start to question, because questioning things is actually tapping into like our emotions
Right.
and our psychological needs
Yeah.
that our parents never got a chance to, because if they did, they wouldn't survive, right?
Yeah. And even more so for, I think, the Khmer Rouge refugees, because not only do they know what it's like to have everything, the physical bare needs completely taken away,
Oh yeah.
and so that in itself, especially if they went through it through their like younger and teenage development years, how ingrained that is in their
Mm-hmm.
psyche, I can only imagine,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah, because when you are trying to physically survive, like not get killed, you're not going to have time to be like, how do I feel today?
Yeah.
Do I feel happy or sad? No, it's not about that. if I sit down for a moment and start to think about how I'm actually feeling, I could be dead right now. Like I would not be able to emotionally or physically survive.
Yeah.
And so in Chinese, there's this saying called 吃苦, which actually means swallow your bitterness. And that's something I think that was developed as a coping mechanism for people who've been in these traumatic situations. Is like swallow the pain and keep moving, because if you take that second to stop and breathe, you're not going to be able to survive.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything that really kids of refugees then can do to help their parents ease some of their pain?
Yeah, I mean, I hear that question and I hear like the heart behind it. And I know that so many of listeners probably have that desire too, but I think it's really about getting to know your parents, like understanding them as people, right? Building that relationship with them, right? Like going in without that agenda, right? Of like, let me ease their pain. Because healthy relationships are the ones that heal like hurts. When you are able to relate to someone in a healthy way, that's going to open up a safe environment, right? And when there is that foundation of love and trust there, that safety is there. And then slowly, like things can start to develop, right? Maybe more things are going to be, revealed. And something to reinforce safety is you have to respect their boundaries.
Yeah.
Right. As a trauma-informed therapist, it's all about consent, right? When we see clients who are resisting, like that, we know, even though they're not verbalizing it, we know that that's a boundary. And for people who have been traumatized, they have been powerless. They did not get to choose. They were thrown into situations that were out of their control. And so when we respect their boundaries, it's giving that control back to say, you get to call the shots. We are not going to bulldoze over and violate your rights and your boundaries.
Yeah.
You are in control of the situation. And when you help your parents, know that they're in control and that their boundaries are respected, then that safety can be created.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many more nuances than to just think, oh, it'd be so much easier if we had a 1, 2, 5 steps on like how to heal a traumatic person.
Yeah.
Like step 1, say
Yeah.
this, talk about this too, and it's just not that way. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also like protective factors, right? As a therapist, I'm always asking my clients, are there things that you feel supported by, things that are going to boost your resilience, right? Because those things are protective factors, things like having a community, supportive community, things like having hobbies, things like, being athletic or not athletic, or liking to do like certain activities, or you're connected to the world and people in some sorts of ways. And those are protective factors that builds your resiliency, so that two people who go through the same traumatic events, right? One person may have one person may have protective factors, the other person doesn't. The one with protective factors is going to come out more resilient, right?
Okay. So is that something that maybe we can then, again, you deal with this hierarchy structure, and it's kind of like hard to suggest things to your parents when you're kind of like a higher and lower situation. But I think, just a lot of listeners do ask me like, how do I even start to peel back these layers? And it is just something, I think what you mentioned is creating a safe space is number one. Having that relationship
and consent.
Yeah.
Ask them.
Yeah.
Hey, do you want to talk about this? Because I'd like to hear.
Yeah.
I'm interested. And then making sure like you are there to be a safe container for them.
Yeah.
Right.
I think a lot about the cost of the silence from the trauma survivors, though. I think a lot about the fact that we only have so much time, I feel like, before a lot of the survivors are gone. And I think about, what do you think is the cost to that silence?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's about connection, right? Like when you are able to break that silence and be raw and vulnerable, that allows you to form this like stronger connection and bond and understanding with each other. And sometimes when someone's guard is so up, you don't truly, it feels like you don't truly get to know your parent. And I think that is a loss
Yeah.
in a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's really painful. So it makes sense to like want to know your parents in those ways. You want to, yeah, you're their kid, right? You want to have that strong foundation with them. But I think it's also knowing like there are a lot of ways to be able to build that foundation too, Um, yeah.
Yeah, I also think about, how envious I am almost about how, let's say, something like the Holocaust is so well documented in terms of the trauma that they had lived, the museums that they get, the books, fiction, both fiction and nonfiction, all the sort of categories that really elevate and educate everybody on the trauma that had happened during that time. And I'm curious to know why we don't have that for the Cambodian genocide. Granted, there's many other genocides out there for sure, but by death toll, I believe the Khmer Rouge is like the second largest genocide and the biggest one within Asia, like one of the biggest ones in Asia as well. And I'm just like, is it a cultural thing? I mean, we talked a little bit about this whole silencing, but is it, and not sharing our feelings, but I wonder, is it cultural? Is it what? Like, why is there such a difference, and what can we do to change that?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, because it makes me think too of like how little literature there is out there on intergenerational trauma specifically for Asian populations, and even Asian American psychology. That in itself is so new. Like even though Asians have been here for so long, right? But like it makes me question, then why is it 2019 or whatever when we had the first movie with the all Asian cast? That's not like just like Joylet Club, right? Like I think it's that same question of like, why is Asian representation like so late, and not just like this thing, but in every aspect. I think it may be, parts of it is the cultural piece, and then parts of it is like the structural racism piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, and especially that topic in itself is a huge topic within the Cambodian American community. It almost becomes, I don't want to say an identifier, but it's something that all of us, second generation, most of us feel like we deal with. I did a poll on Instagram about 8 months ago where I asked my listeners whether or not they identify with experiencing generational trauma. And 70% said yes. 70% said yes, I identify with having that. For everybody, can you just define what is intergenerational trauma? I mean, from a therapist perspective.
Yeah, so intergenerational trauma was actually coined by psychologists. It's not a diagnosis, but it's like a phenomenon coined by psychologists. Actually, they studied the offspring of Holocaust survivors, and that's when they started to develop this term intergenerational trauma.
Okay.
So speaking of research, right? So intergenerational trauma is when the psychological distress of what the traumatized person experienced is transferred and passed down to their offspring, even though their offspring, I can't say that word, offspring, did not directly experience the trauma themselves.
Right.
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 So when I talk about psychological distress, I think a lot of the symptomology you see is a lot of anxiety or depression. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Anxiety, depression. I can also imagine, are there other ones that stand out besides that? I feel like I deal with a lot of negative talk myself from my own therapy journey, but like, are there other ones that you've noticed as well?
Yeah. So with like negative talk, all those things are within the umbrella of depression. So if you look at the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, right? Negative perception of self, negative talk, low self-esteem,
Mm.
low mood. There is lack of pleasure. There's lack of motivation. So there's there's multiple symptoms within the umbrella of the diagnoses.
Mm-hmm.
And then anxiety, they manifest in perfectionism or like overthinking, rumination. Right. It can also stem from like negative self perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and it makes sense because, and I hope this is okay if I go into like the background of why, but
Sure.
um, just, when your parents, have experienced trauma changes the way a person starts to see themselves
Mm-hmm.
and the world. It changes everything, their whole world view, right?
Yeah.
So a world that used to be like safe and livable and happy, all of a sudden something traumatic happens. It's no longer safe. It's a place that's hostile. And we have to do certain things to protect us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the worldview that is now internalized.
Yeah.
Then when you have children, right, like because of your worldview, you're going to parent your children in specific ways. So if you believe that your environment is really hostile,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be like maybe overprotective of your children, like
Yeah.
really strict or really rigid, right?
Yeah.
Because your worldview is like the world is not safe.
Yeah.
Right. And people who've experienced trauma, like such as genocide, like separation, like if you're separated from your siblings or your family, like that means death. Like you're not going to see them again.
Yeah.
Right. So that fear can come and translate into their own children of like, if I'm separated from you, like, what does that mean? Because I've experienced that loss of separation and that was huge. Right. So there's this overprotectiveness, this rigidness. When those behaviors are, when they're parented in that way, children, as they're developing, like start to develop that worldview too, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the world must not be a safe place because of the fact that my parents are parenting me in this way, right? They may not say it verbally, but I can tell by their actions that there's this undercurrent of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe kids grow up not understanding why, parents operate in this way or that way, but they start to develop those behaviors too.
Right. But wouldn't it be easy to say then, or well, what is the difference between then just being able to say like I have depression and anxiety versus generational trauma? Like where is the fine line? Because technically, I mean, I mean, couldn't you say that any parent out there is always going to parent based on their previous past and therefore, you know, or is always going to have that bias and perception on life? Like, how do you define the difference between what is generational trauma versus what is solely anxiety and depression?
History of trauma, right? Because the classic, one of the in the diagnoses, like you have to have experienced trauma in order to be diagnosed with PTSD,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And so for intergenerational trauma, it's like someone in your family has to have experienced trauma, a traumatic, whether directly or even, like even if it's heard, like that could be traumatic or vicarious, right? Like
Yeah.
even though it's not directly to you, like you're nearby. So yeah, that's the classic thing. But when you think about it and you think about most people in most countries having experienced colonization and xenophobia, racism, trauma, like most people of color and even like non-people of color like have experienced some shape or form of trauma. And that's not to minimize like what Cambodian refugees have gone through, but it's also to not identify with it so strongly as if like that's your identity, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I definitely wanted to dive into that as well. Taking on the identity of generational trauma. I wanted to talk to you and ask you, what is the benefit and what is the downside, I guess, of labeling yourself as having generational trauma? Because when I asked that question, I had 70% of the listeners say, yes, I do. But then I had 30% who were Cambodian, who were second generation, Cambodian Americans who said no. And I always had a question of what made the person say yes and what made the person say no. And is there a harm or a benefit to claiming one or the other?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not easy to answer because for
I
some
know.
people, like for some
Yeah.
people, it's like a relief to be like, oh, okay, this is why. Like, this helps me better understand and have compassion and grace for my parents, knowing that, like, they didn't do this, like, because they wanted to hurt me or whatever. They did this out of their own pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for some, it really helps. But for others, it, like, sends them through a spiral of, like, self pathologizing and, like, why, and, like, trying to figure themselves and why am I this way? And so this is why, like, as clinicians, like, we are really, really careful when it comes to like disclosing diagnoses or like talking about it.
Yeah.
But I also want to mention how like intergenerational trauma is not a diagnosis. It does not mean that you have PTSD.
Yeah.
No, right? It just means that like there are certain like patterns or things or certain views, cognitive distortions, if you will, like
Mm-hmm.
certain ways of viewing the world that were influenced by your parents' views of the world, that were influenced by fear or
Yeah.
pain and trauma,
Yeah.
right? Doesn't mean that you have PTSD.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've listened to other podcasts about and some people say that self-labeling can be dangerous and some people say self-labeling can be helpful. And so it is hard. It really depends on how the person internalizes their diagnoses. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But also hold that like intergenerational trauma is not a diagnosis. So, like, you don't want to be like, oh, like I'm traumatized,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
I, as a clinician, am more on the like non pathological, like, you know, like end of the
Yeah.
spectrum because the last thing I want is for people to start to think that there's something wrong with them because a lot of it is structural, cultural, a lot of like, systems and forces that have subjugated us that made us internalize things about ourselves,
Mhm.
right? When you start to pathologize those things, right? Like, and kind of internalize it like as like it's my fault, you start to believe like, yeah, you start to take that responsibility on instead of seeing like, no, it's this effed up, like patriarchal society that causes women to be this. And this is why I have imposter syndrome or
Right.
whatever, right?
Right.
Like, So in my work, I'm all about kind of uncovering the layers. There's always the structural, systemic, macro level,
Mm.
and then there's the micro level, which is more of like the individual. So it's like learning to hold both. And this is why it's so important to understand your cultural heritage, to understand like the socio-political environment,
Mhm.
because it gives you context like for how you grew up,
Right.
and it'll help you understand like, oh, this is why these behaviors develop. They didn't just come out of the vacuum. It didn't come out because I was effed up,
Mhm.
right? It came out because I was put into this environment
Mhm.
that forced me to develop these patterns in order to survive.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's like what I've learned in therapy in like a 1 minute spiel. Yeah.
I try. I'm like, I don't know how fast or how much I can say about this, but
I know. Yeah. No, that's a great way of putting it. For people, for refugees, for people, yeah, refugees who want a way to heal themselves but don't believe in therapy and don't believe,
Mhm.
which I feel like a lot of the older generation Asian person does not
Yeah.
understand therapy. Like, is it possible then to heal themselves beside, I mean, you talked about community, you talked about, I'm thinking, I'm just trying to think of like actionable items that we can kind of
Hmm.
share with them if they don't believe in therapy or don't want to do it.
Yeah. To answer a question, is it possible? That's a hard question because I don't know if it's possible to heal 100% anyone, like,
Mhm.
from, these wounds and stuff. Is it possible to have a really fulfilling and like thriving life? Yeah, absolutely, without therapy, and therapy is really a really Eurocentric and Western field.
Sure.
Um, and when you go back to, this is why like decolonizing therapy is actually tapping into like the collectivistic like ways of healing, which is like using your supportive community, going back into like indigenizing it too, like
Mm.
going back to your roots, because in every community there's always people who are the healers of their community, right?
Oh,
And like, there's shamans, there's spiritual guides, healers, whatnot. There's, people who are pastors, religious, figures and stuff. And they all heal like aspects of who we are, because we're so much more than just the mind.
yeah.
Eurocentric talk therapy is very intellectualizing, and it only talks about that mind, where that may not work for everyone. That might not be everybody's cup of tea to talk about their feelings, especially if they've never grown up talking about it, right?
Yeah.
So then they can look for more embodied forms of healing, like, which is like, energy work or things like that. That's very rooted in Eastern medicine, right? There's other ways that are less taboo, but that fit with who you are and what your culture, will approve of, right? It's actually relying on the strengths of your culture, not forcing, someone to go into like experience like the healing of another culture, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. This is really, really informative because I think about the future of this podcast. And one of the goals for me and the podcast is answering this question of like, how many people can we heal? How many more refugees can we heal with the time that we have left? And I I can't answer that question myself without turning to therapists like you and people who are more informed about how to deal with situations like this. So
Mhm.
it's it is what I'm hearing though is that it's just so different for everybody
Yeah.
and it's hard to even say it starts with consent, it starts with safety if the person even wants to heal. Is that right? Is that if the person
Mhm.
is open
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
healing?
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. because you can't force someone to heal, right? You can lead the horse to the water, right? And actually, like, clients who have experienced PTSD, drop out of treatment because they feel like, they're forced to tell their stories,
Mm.
right? So it can backfire when we're trying to force that. But I think I hear your heart, and I think that's such a beautiful, mission, and it's so noble. And I think that healing, like others' healing, is going to be the byproduct of your healing. As you share your story, and as your dad shares his story of healing, right? Then that be the focal point. Like, everything else is a ripple effect. Everything else is the byproduct of that. So rather than focus on that external piece, it's like focusing as you tell your truth, right? Trusting that that's going to start to unfold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you recommend for the second generation then, the ones that deal with intergenerational trauma, people like me and kids of refugees? What is your advice on how to tackle it?
Ooh, tackle intergenerational trauma. I think it really comes from really loving yourself first and foremost. That sounds really simple to say, but as children of, our parents who've experienced trauma, we grow up seeing like how much they've sacrificed, right? How much pain that they've gone through, when we've made ourselves small to not be a burden or to cause friction or to add to their pain,
Yeah.
right? And in doing so, sometimes we suffer silently. And not only do we suffer silently, but we have taken on the role as the protector and sometimes the caregivers, the navigators, the cultural brokers, sometimes the parents of our parents. And we've lost that time of being just a child, like free of adult responsibilities. And so I think it really comes with allowing yourself to not minimize your pain anymore and to validate it. And I think that a lot of people may have resistance to that because of the fear that if they give validity to their pain, does that mean that they're blaming their parents?
Yeah.
And I would say that there's more layers to that. It's not so black and white, right? Um, there is what I don't know where to start with this, but
Yeah.
when you are able to separate like your parents' actions from like who they are as people,
Yeah.
right? You're going to be able to understand it's not them who wants to hurt you, right? But it's the
Yeah.
actions, right? Because it's what they went through,
Right.
right? Even though the intention was not to hurt, the impact was it did hurt,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So, what does it mean to allow yourself to grieve and feel that hurt, knowing that that was not the intention, right? Just because you feel that hurt doesn't mean you're blaming your parents. It means you're human,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, allowing yourself to feel that, and it doesn't mean that like you're being a bad daughter or son or that you're blaming your parents. It's you being able to separate that my parents, like their actions are different than who they are. I was hurt by their actions, not them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that also ties into, a lot of why I feel so much satisfaction from this podcast. I've heard people DM me and say, listening to your podcast has given me so much more empathy for my own parent because they weren't able to verbalize it to me. I at least was able to listen to your father's story and be like, oh, whoa, this is what they lived through. Like, this is crazy. Like, I can understand now why my childhood was the way it was. And so, this was incredible. Thank you so much for allowing me to pick your brain. I almost feel like I may potentially call you back for a part 2 because I just have so many more questions, and I have so many more questions that I feel like that I feel like our listeners would want to listen to. Before we end, though, last time I did ask a lot of our listeners on what they would want to ask you. And so we're going to take a minute to go through those questions. Give me a second. First question I have here. How do we handle language barriers when it comes to addressing trauma?
I think that's a huge question, but it also makes me wonder, what do you mean about addressing trauma? Like, do you mean like educating about trauma? Do you mean talking to your parents, like just having a conversation about trauma?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean, right? Like, and if there are language barriers, right, I think it's finding services or people that provide those language translations, like psychoeducation materials that can be, used. And then there's also this new game actually called Parents Are Human, and they, I think that's what it's called, but they translate the card game into different languages.
Oh, wow.
And it's a way to better understand your parents, like asking them about their childhood, like, hey, like, what was your favorite food growing up or whatever. And I think it's these conversation starters that may start to give you insight to, your parents' lives that is done in an environment that's like more playful and less high risk, right? Because it's a game, it's a card game, right?
Yeah.
So it's an invitation. It's not like, oh, tell me your trauma.
Yeah. I like that. I like that idea because it allows them to have this little kind of safety bubble. Like, if you don't know how to create your own safety bubble for your parents, but you want to learn, okay, let's try this game. Like, it's a safe area that maybe, might not work for everybody, but it can be a starting point.
Yeah. And I think if the person asking is asking about their own language barrier with their parents, right? Them not being able to, well, one, the game helps because there's English and the language.
Right.
But it's also like finding different ways to relate, right? Like, you may not be able to talk about the trauma itself, but trauma is experiential, right? So there may be like things that maybe your parents avoid doing or whatever that you can join them on. And in doing so, like creating like safe spaces, like going to certain places or whatever. That in itself like can be a way to connect and overcome that language piece.
Yeah. That makes total sense. I think the rest of the questions really here, though. One other one was, I think you talked about this before, but it says different ways to process trauma without having traditional talk therapy. So different ways to process trauma without doing talk therapy. I think you mentioned that before.
Yeah. And, to even reiterate, like, trauma is stored in your body. Like, it's a visceral experience. Actually, talk therapy is the least effective way to process trauma. Yeah.
can you reiterate on that a little bit more? Like,
Yeah.
when I think talk therapy, that's sitting down with somebody and talking to them. If it's within your body,
Hmm.
how do you release that? I mean, you're saying that talking is the least effective? Really?
Yeah. So when you're talking to someone, like bringing it forces you to have to like bring up those things. And then all of a sudden your body will react and then you're not going to want to talk about it anymore.
Mm.
Especially if you experience like really intense trauma, like you may even dissociate, which means that you sort of have this out of body experience. And for me as a clinician, I can see it in my clients' eyes. Like I can tell like they're no longer there. They're just like their eyes are glazed and they're just like out of it, right? And
Mm.
what that does is a protective factor because when people experience trauma, like their bodies are unsafe, so they go inward, right? They
Mhm.
escape inside because they're physically unsafe and they're just not there. And so there's different ways to heal. There's different like modalities that trauma trained therapists use. Like for me, I use something called EMDR, which is called eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. And it uses bilateral stimulation, which is the movement of the eyes or like tapping your body or things like that. Because when we do that, it changes, it activates different waves in the brain that actually grounds the body, that actually tells the body that
Mhm.
the body is safe, like you are here, right?
Wow.
And when your body feels safe and grounded, that's when you can start to access that trauma, that traumatic memory without the visceral physiological symptoms stopping you, right?
Mhm.
Because normal talk therapy, it comes, your body reacts, you stop talking,
Mm.
right? And it gets stuck there and you hit a wall. You might get some benefit and relief from talking about it a little bit, but then ultimately you hit some kind of wall.
Yeah.
And so EMDR and another type of trauma therapy is called havening. It uses touch because when you stimulate, and I'm touching over for the listeners, like touching above my eyebrows and under my eyes and doing sort of like the circular motion. Yeah. And then even like across my shoulders and down my arms, like I'm hugging myself, but like
Mhm.
sliding down. What that does is it activates delta waves in your brain. And delta waves are actually like the soothing waves to facilitate sleep and relaxation. So
Mm.
when you're traumatized, right, in a havening session, you would be, stimulating your delta waves through touch while sort of accessing and talking about like the traumatic incident.
Wow.
Yeah.
So these are definitely resources in ways like if somebody didn't want to do traditional talk therapy, they can look for therapists that specialize in these different types of therapy, right? That may
Mm-hmm.
help them if they notice that just simply talking only gets them so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And other embodied forms, like for others, like even yoga, it releases tension.
Mhm.
Trauma can be like condensed in certain places in your body. And as you stretch, you're releasing it
Yeah,
and you're allowing that energy to flow through you.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Or massages even.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, this was so informational, Angela. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Can you let everybody know where can they find you? And I know on social media, the Sassy Asian Therapist, but where else are you found and located?
Yeah, you can find me on my website, www.thesassyasiantherapist.com. Yeah, I have a Psychology Today link as well. And, if you search Google, like I have some articles that feature me. I do talk about intergenerational trauma and other things like that about the Asian experience. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again. I can only imagine. I got so much out of just like sitting here. I can only imagine the pieces and the nuggets that the listeners will be able to kind of grab onto and kind of think about. So, Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. As I said, oh my gosh, if I have any more questions, I'm probably going to poke you about it. And, I feel like we can talk about this for forever. Like this can
Yeah,
really go.
it's a big topic.
It is a huge topic.
Yeah.
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 Thanks
Well,
so
thank
much.
you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
And thank you for doing what you're doing, and your dad for coming out and sharing his story. Like, it's a lot. It's not something small, and I think you're making huge waves and impacts, and
Thank
keep
you.
going.
Thank you so much.